Alright, now let's get into B-roll stuff. I should also probably close the door. Welcome back to an archaeologist. Today, we're going to be looking at the Cottonwood Charcoal Kilns. And I am currently parked on a road that had a historical sign for the marker to the Cottonwood Charcoal Kilns. And this might be the road to the actual charcoal kilns. So we're going to go drive down the road and take a look. All right, so we've arrived at the Cottonwood Charcoal Kilns, which are over there. Hopefully that's getting in camera. So what else do we know besides what was on the plaque? We know that the Cottonwood Charcoal Kilns made charcoal for the mine of Cerro Gordo, which is across the river. I don't know if you can see that, but yeah, we're not going to be able to see the other side of the lake today. Well, I mean, we will later when I walk over there. But right now, we can't see it from where I'm standing explaining what the Cottonwood Charcoal Kilns were for. And like I said earlier, there was apparently a log flume around here, which would indicate that this area was definitely a lot less dry and windy and gross than it is currently. And that's all due to the LA Department of Water and Power siphoning all the water from this area. In fact, the sign mentioned that this used to be a creek, or the side of a creek, which is definitely possible, just judging looking at the topography. And the fact that that trestle back there would not have been necessary if there wasn't a creek flowing through there. We know why the Cottonwood Charcoal Kilns were here, but why charcoal? That's probably the first thing, I ask myself every time I drove by. And it's because in the 1870s, 1860s, I guess, through 70s, when the Cottonwood Charcoal Kilns were in use, the only way you could smelt ore was to use charcoal. And the only way to derive charcoal was to burn it naturally. And the question becomes, why charcoal? And the reason why they used charcoal as opposed to just throwing logs into the smelters that they were using is because raw wood or raw coal that hadn't been turned into charcoal would burn too hot and too fast to smelt the iron at the proper temperature for the proper amount of time, which I did not know until I decided to do this episode and looked into the Cottonwood Charcoal Kilns, which is super, super, super ironic. Because I actually did a project in central Nevada where they were manufacturing charcoal using charcoal platforms. And this was roughly around the same period as well. And man, that was some difficult survey because charcoal platforms do not leave a lot of traces on the landscape, especially after 150 years. And a charcoal platform is basically a platform usually made out of rocks, and then you throw the lumber you cut down on top of it, cover it up. Well, but you light it up, then cover it up, and then uncover it, and you've got charcoal. Unfortunately, burnt wood and rocks, especially when you put them in a wash, don't leave a lot of traces after 150 years, which is why this site right here is pretty cool. Just the fact that they were using structures here indicates our first clue, namely that this was a pretty large industrial scale operation. I mean, it would kind of have to be if there were two towns right next to each other dedicated to supporting the Cerro Gordo mine. In addition to that, they built China Lake, which is where I am headed today for work. That was like one of the working camps for Cerro Gordo. So you have towns on this side and towns on the other side of the mountain from Cerro Gordo, which would indicate that it was a huge operation, especially by 1860s, 1870s standards. So the first thing we'll notice is that the sign here is missing, the sign plaque. I assume that that is the sign plaque that is actually out by the road. maybe not enough people were stopping, or they felt that maybe too many people were stealing the sign from here. So they felt a lot safer keeping it by the road where they could possibly keep an eye on it. I think that's really impressive is that there's still charcoal staining after 150 years, which is crazy. And if you look at these metal things, you'll probably get a better view looking inside. Those are possibly where there would have been supports for the wood that they were turning into charcoal. Maybe they use them as ventilation. These are definitely very professionally, deliberately designed structures, as opposed to the more ad hoc build with what you've got in the area structures I'm used to seeing in some of these smaller to mid-sized mines in Nevada. In addition to that, I'm also very impressed with how much actually remains in terms of being able to tell that this was a oven/kiln. I mean, that's goddamn. I probably shouldn't have done that. Pretend you didn't see that. For instance, take a look at the charcoal scarring that still remains. That's very interesting. I'm also very impressed that there aren't more bullet holes in here. I'm always, as someone who comes from Nevada, I'm always used to things being full of bullet holes. These things down here, I don't know what they would have been used for. But looking at them, they look like ventilation, like they look like flues, effectively, if you're familiar, if your house has a fireplace. Basically, you would have opened and closed them to allow ventilation in, or to control how hot they were burning. At least that's my speculation. If you look up there, you see what would have been the chimney structure area. In fact, let's go look at the other one. And there is a more intact one right there. And if you see the two little pins sticking out, I assume that that would have controlled a flap. A flap that would have closed the oven and basically turned it off. You know, you close that, and then you close the intake ventilation, and that would have effectively choked off the air and shut the kiln down, so that way they could either remove the charcoal they had just made or load up more wood to be turned into charcoal. Ah, see, there are some bullet holes right there. At least I'd assume those are bullet holes. They're too irregular a pattern to be anything official or anything associated with this structure when it was in use. And now that we're close up, we can see more with the construction. Originally, I wanted to call these adobe bricks, but looking at the remains, oh, all right, I probably should not have done that. Shh, let's pretend you didn't see that one either. But yeah, so this was adobe brick construction. Other things I note as I'm walking around is that, as far as I know, there would have been no way to tell if the wrinkly texture of the exterior of the building is just due to how the buildings have aged for 150 years, or if this is what they would have looked like originally. Definitely one of the sad things about the fact that there's such scant information about this area, or about what was going on 150 years ago, which I guess shouldn't be that much of a surprise. The Owens Valley, as I said before, was lush and verdant before where LA took all the water. And if you look around, you can still see signs that this was all woodland at some point. You can also recognize that this may still have been a creek, even though I'll be the first to admit landscapes change so dramatically over decades, let alone over 150 years. Across the way are the towns of Keeler and Swansea, or Swansea if you prefer, which are the towns where the charcoal made by the kilns would have been sent by boat, which is especially hard to imagine now that it's just a big, big sand bowl. And Keeler and Swansea would have smelted the ore coming down from the Cerro Gordo mine, and then shipped it back across the lake to be put on a train to Los Angeles. Unfortunately, I don't have much hope that I'll be finding any artifacts dating back 150 years, especially given that the landscape is just shifting sands and a lot of wind these days. So this is the railroad grade that went through the Owens Valley, apparently. Obviously, there's nothing left in terms of railroad ties, telegraph poles, or anything other than these trestle structures, which definitely show us that this is probably, definitely a creek. I know I said that before, but it's one of those it's one of those logic things we use as archaeologists to figure out what was going on here. The sign said that the Cottonwood Charcoal Kilns were right next to a creek. And if you look at the way the landscape holds out, it definitely looks like it may have been just the right shape for a creek. And obviously, we have the railroad trestle here, which would further support the fact that this was probably a creek, because otherwise, why would you have it here? In addition to that, I know I said earlier that it's unlikely this is from the 1870s, but this railroad trestle is definitely surprisingly old. It definitely predates the 1930s, just looking at the quality of the construction. They definitely would have used a very different construction following the 1930s/40s. So we can definitely tell that this railroad trestle was not original in the 1870s, but that this railroad alignment possibly was. In fact, maybe... You know, it's really interesting looking at these pieces of lumber. These may possibly have originally been railroad ties that they just reused for some weird reason. I don't know why they'd reuse them. Maybe to mark out the fact that there are railroad trestles here, and that if you're coming along in your ATV, not to go over them or down into them, I guess. So after walking around here for a long while and not seeing anything but cow pies, it's just as I thought. It's always extremely unlikely that you're going to find artifacts on the surface when the sand is this, when the soil composition is mostly sand, and it's just this windy. I've heard that the wind here can get crazy, and that's almost constant. Alright, so here is a hopper open can. If you watched one of my previous episodes where I went through a random garbage dump, you will know that a hopper open can is a very old can opening type, which does not, however, date it back to when the Cerro Gordo mine was in operation, but it probably does date it back to before the LA stole all the water in the 20s, 30s, I want to say. So we know, at the very least, just looking around, well, we definitely know that there was wood here, because you look at it in the distance, and that there were people living here, and that this was a very different landscape. While there isn't much evidence left over from the days when the Cottonwood Charcoal Kilns were operating, there's definitely evidence of continued use in the area. Mainly the fact that I continue to find cans that predate the 1930s as I walk around. For instance, this is a hole-and-cap can, and it would have had its top soldered on first. Then the contents would have been inserted through the cap in the top, and then that was soldered shut. Then the cans were sterilized, and the small hole in the center was a vent, which was sealed after the contents were sterilized. This was a really laborious process, and companies moved away from that as soon as they could. I also noted that I did not find any artifacts near the kilns themselves, although that's not really much of a surprise given how many travelers and tourists have probably passed by the kilns during the past 150 years. The thing that I find interesting as an archaeologist is how far the charcoal kilns were from the lakeshore itself, because there's the railroad trestle just walked over. The charcoal kilns are about 50 feet beyond that. And I presume that the lakeshore is well beyond where that tree is in the distance. Because landscapes might change, especially ones like this one that are very sandy. But lake shores are pretty easy to pick out in terms of where they would have been originally. So I have been seeing random scattered can fragments here and there. There was even another one right there. And this shows me that this was a pretty active wash slash creek. Because if it wasn't that vigorous a wash and or creek, these cans would have just stayed where they were deposited, which isn't that uncommon. It's why you end up with can dumps, especially in mines. But the fact that I see just the random sprinkling of cans, and they all seem to be from the same era, indicates that this is a pretty active wash. At least it used to be. I'm not sure about now, since it's March. This one still has some lithography on it. I don't even know what it says, but to me that's really cool. Wait, let's see. Oh my god, I can actually read part of it. Apparently this was the lid to a tobacco tin. Here, I believe, we might have the other half of the tobacco can. Perhaps it was a cylinder. It was a, no, interesting. This actually looks like the remains possibly either another can or the base of the can that we were just looking at. So I'm not going to walk all the way through there, but it is interesting that as I walked from there, from my truck over to here, that there's still very definite signs of the lush, verdant area that the Owens Valley used to be. And it's kind of depressing when you think about it. It's like, it's just such a testament to the impact people can have on the environment. I like deserts normally, but I like natural deserts. Deserts like the ones I'm used to back in Nevada. Not man-made ones, because LA needed to water its lawns or fill its pools. And that was the Cottonwood Charcoal Kiln. I realize that's not a lot to go on. But sometimes, as an archaeologist, you don't have a lot to go on. You just have a few scrap fragments of things in the landscape to be able to tell what was going on. So, what can I tell from this place? I would have been able to tell that at the very least, there was a drainage, possibly an ephemeral drainage running through here. I would not have known it was a creek just because of how fast the landscape would change, especially given the winds and the high sand content of the soil. I would have been able to tell that there were a lot more trees here than there are currently. Without knowing my California history, I would not have been able to know that that's due to LA stealing all the water. I would have been able to tell that there was a railroad running through here, and that judging by the construction and the cans I found nearby, the railroad was at least in use through the 1930s, if not later. I would have definitely known that there were ovens here. I wouldn't have known that they were charcoal kilns, obviously, since I'm not an expert on charcoal kilns, but I would have at least known that those were ovens. That's pretty obvious. And I speculate, even though there's no evidence for it, I speculate that there were definitely more. You know, judging or knowing what I know about how large the Cerro Gordo mine was, and that it had a tramway, and that there were two towns built. And at one point, those two towns were in operation at the same time to smelt all the silver that was coming out of the Cerro Gordo mines. I would have known that that was a large industrial operation, and that two of these kilns are definitely nowhere near enough to like make enough charcoal to support an operation that big. But other than that, that's about everything I would have been able to pull out of this location given the scant artifacts. But I feel like that is a pretty good That's pretty good reasoning, given what's here. And we definitely know more about the area than we would have before. Which is all archaeologists really do. We just tell you more about an area than you knew before. Anyway, I'm going to wrap it up here. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. And if you found that useful, you're welcome. Have a good day, Junior Archaeologist.